My tagline on my personal email is shown here. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look backward at the beginning of the nuclear industry, nuclear age, and we're going to see where we stand today and then look forward into the future. I don't know how many of you have seen or heard about George Allen's book, Complex Transformation, but after he retired from NNSA, he traveled around the country and visited over 200 sites that were involved in building what we used to call the weapons complex, what we now call the nuclear industry, a prop for George. He did that pro bono, by the way. He just did it out of his love of riding a motorcycle, his fascination with the nuclear weapons industry, and an opportunity to grow a ponytail. He had 3 reasons. So we're going to look backward and we're going to look forward, and we have 3 people who understand the enterprise intimately, and I think you'll find this very interesting. First presenter is going to be Everet Beckner. Dr. Beckner retired from the Department of Energy as the Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs. He had previously served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense Programs. And in between those 2 tours, he was the Deputy Chief Executive at the Atomic Weapons Establishment in Great Britain. Prior to that, he spent over 28 years at Sandia as a scientist and manager, and comes to us with a wealth of knowledge about the industry. He has been a consultant since then to DOE, NNSA, the national labs. He's been an advisor and an advisor to TechSource as well. And he is going to talk to us about the beginning and the dawn of the nuclear age.
For those of you who are interested in having pictures of everything that anybody might have ever known or been to in the so-called nuclear weapon complex, it's in George's book. And I have to give him credit in the front slide there. Most of the photos that you're going to see here this morning came out of this book. But we're going to start in 1932 because that's when Chadwick discovered the neutron. Without the neutron, none of this would have worked. And with the neutron, of course, it all worked eventually. That was 1932. So the real champion has to be Chadwick, finding the neutron, and then Hahn and Strassman discovering the fissioning of uranium. From that point forward, December of 38, things moved very, very rapidly. And much of it was because of 3 Hungarians who happened to have already fled Europe in order to get out of Nazi Germany and its environs. That being Szilard, Wigner, and Edward Teller. Now, the letter that was drafted for Einstein to send to Roosevelt regarding the possibility of making a bomb, since people were beginning to understand the ramifications of fissioning of uranium, Teller wasn't there to help draft the letter, but the 3 of them worked hand in hand in that period from 38 to about 40, 41, trying to build momentum and concern among the scientific community in the US about the fact that Germany might be able to develop a nuclear weapon. There was no concern about Japan at that time. It was all concern about Germany. Not the least of the reason being Heisenberg was what you might say the chief scientist to Hitler at the time. And so there was still in Germany a very large community of scientists who were available to be put into a nuclear weapon program in Germany. So the urgency to proceed with a US program, in fact, was first carried by these 3 guys from Hungary who happened to be refugees in the US, namely Szilard, Wigner, and Teller. As you can see, in 39, they got the letter to Roosevelt. By October of that year, Roosevelt established an advisory committee, and it was chaired by Lyman Briggs, Briggs being at that time the Bureau of Standards director. And it had as members Szilard, Teller, Wigner, a member from Carnegie Institute. That institution will show up later on in the talk. An Army member, a Navy member. And out of it, Fermi and Szilard got $6,000 so that they go back mostly at Columbia University, buy some uranium and some graphite and get on with research to see if they could really understand fission. By March of 40, notice how rapidly things are now going to move along. By March of 40, 2 more German refugees, Frisch and Perels, who were working in the UK but were actually German, and another group in the UK wrote a report called the Mod Report, and I don't know what that acronym stands for anymore, but anyway, but all of that led to these 2 immigrants, or refugees, pushing the argument that they had done enough calculations to conclude you should be able to make a bomb of at least a kiloton. Out of that, by September of 42, Congress had taken action to, well, the administration more so than Congress, had taken action to form the Manhattan Project. We're now in September of 42. And shortly thereafter, he selected J. Robert Oppenheimer as his scientific advisor. I've never seen the list, I don't suppose it exists, as to who else might have been selected. But in fact, he chose Oppenheimer, and I would say it was, without a doubt, the best decision he ever made. You notice that's September of 42. By November, Groves that is, and Oppenheimer had selected Los Alamos to be the site for the scientific laboratory. At this point in time, they already knew enough about what they were going to be trying to do to know that they needed a scientific laboratory. They were going to need scientific work done to develop the ideas. They were going to need highly enriched uranium. They already knew that much about it. And they already knew that if it were possible to generate plutonium in quantity, and if it were possible to make a bomb out of plutonium, they would also want plutonium. So it turned out Oppenheimer had personally vacationed in New Mexico in the Los Alamos area, and so he and Groves looked at a place that was essentially what I would describe as a Boy Scout camp at that time, selected it for the laboratory to be built. This is November of 42. Think about that. By 45, they're going to have a bomb, and in 42, they're trying to find a place to build a laboratory. And then Groves selected Oak Ridge to be the site where he would do enrichment of uranium, because they knew they would have to have enriched uranium, not just uranium, but enriched uranium. So some way they were going to develop a technology and build a plant to make enriched uranium. And then subsequently, Groves also selected Hanford, Washington to be the site for development of the reactors and construction of the reactors to generate plutonium from uranium. All of that in November of 42. By December, just for the record, Vannevar Bush estimated the cost of the program at $400 million. That was his estimate of what it was going to cost to get to the bomb, $400 million. Who knows how he did it? I certainly don't, but it's on the record. Construction then in November of 42 began at Los Alamos, and you can see here the the main gate, picture of the main gate at Los Alamos at the time they were beginning to build the laboratory. You see here also a mock-up of the reactor that Fermi used at Stagg Field to prove out the ideas that they were going to be able to count on the fissioning of uranium if they got that far with the project. You can see it was really quite large. It was the critical experiment that convinced everyone that they knew what they were doing. It wasn't that they were building a bomb here, but they knew how and in particular Fermi, Enrico Fermi, an Italian immigrant, led the team that built the reactor at Stagg Field and went critical in December of '42. So now we're closing in on what will turn out to be little more than 2.5 years until they're actually going to have the Trinity test at White Sands. So in 2.5 years, you go from the first operation of a nuclear reactor to what amounts to the first successful design of a new concept for making a nuclear weapon. By August of '45, you've detonated the bomb at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki, and the Japanese have surrendered shortly thereafter. At that point, somebody went and added up the numbers and said, well, as a matter of fact, it cost $2 billion. Didn't cost 200 million, cost 2 billion. Factor of 10, not bad. From this point on, things go in many, many directions, but one of the significant events is in January '47, actually, I think I made a mistake, and that's really August of '46, the AEC is formed. By the time Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the war has come to an end, shortly thereafter, Oppenheimer resigns as lab director. He wants to go, he and many, many of the other scientists who were at Los Alamos at the time want to go back to their old job, and do go back to their old job. Oppenheimer had retained his position at UC Berkeley, and he took a position when he resigned at Los Alamos to go to spend time both at Berkeley, back at Berkeley, and at Caltech. So he actually taught at least one course at Caltech shortly after leaving Los Alamos. But in fact, he becomes an air traveler at a time when it wasn't 500 miles an hour, but you traveled places at 280 miles an hour in a DC-6 or a Constellation. And he's commuting more or less from either Albuquerque or California into Washington very, very frequently, because he becomes, in fact, the most famous physicist in the world. He's on Time magazine, you name it. He is the most famous technical consultant that anyone can use, and he wants to stay involved as the nation goes through this period of trying to decide what to do next. Because after the bombs at Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the end of the war, and the fact that many of the scientists were leaving Los Alamos, the real question was, what's the program going to do now? And Oppenheimer was in the middle of that. He was terribly torn as to whether he should stay involved, and if so, in what way, because nobody knew what was the right thing to do at that point in time. In the background, of course, you have Edward Teller, who has been involved in the program all along. He's been at Los Alamos. And so the question became one of dealing with Teller, who, of course, wanted to pursue the super, and the other extreme, which Oppenheimer himself endorsed for perhaps 6 months to a year, and that was trying to get the world, through the UN or otherwise, to decide not to build any more nuclear weapons. Try to stop the program at that point and not go forward. So there was a huge discussion among the community as to what to do. We'll move ahead to August of '49 because this is a point in which things really changed. Between '45 and '49, there was this big struggle among one group of people who wanted to move ahead. Teller in particular tried to develop the so-called super, the hydrogen bomb. The other extreme was try to freeze the program and get the whole world to agree that there would be no more development of nuclear weapons. And in between, of course, you had people with the argument that, well, you can't uninvent physics, and unless you have a significant control mechanism, you're not going to be able to just get the world to agree to not build any more nuclear weapons. Well, by now, Norris Bradbury had been named lab director at Los Alamos, and the people who remained behind, and there were a lot of them, continued to work to improve the designs that had been brought forward to that time. They knew early on that the gun-type weapon using enriched uranium was going to work, to the extent that they never tested it. What they didn't know was whether they could make plutonium work as a bomb. And they got a big disappointment fairly late in the 44 time frame when they discovered that they were not going to be able to make a gun-type weapon using plutonium. They wanted to use plutonium because they knew they would need less material and it would be more lightweight because it had a larger fission cross-section. But they discovered that some of the higher isotopes of plutonium spontaneously emitted enough neutrons that you could never assemble a gun-type weapon made out of plutonium. So in a period of about 6 months, maybe a year, they had to develop the implosion design for plutonium, which they successfully did, and which was tested, of course, in the first test called Trinity at White Sands. So the work to be done between 45 and whenever, 50 or later, really was a matter of optimizing around these two designs, the gun-type weapon and the implosion weapon, plutonium and enriched uranium. Now, as you might imagine, during this period from 42 to 45, Groves and the contractors who he hired to build the reactors at Hanford and to build the enrichment plants at Oak Ridge were driving their teams to make material so that they would, without enriched uranium or without plutonium, they weren't going to make bombs. So there was a huge amount of strain and anxiety and very, very hard work to generate those materials. Some of the individuals who came out of this effort, of course, were people like Ernest Lawrence, E.O. Lawrence, who had previously won the Nobel Prize for developing the schemes to use magnetic fields to accelerate ions. And so Lawrence brought forward a contraption called a calutron, which was a big magnetic field where you would separate the heavy isotope U-238 from the lighter isotope U-235 using the difference in radius for those two ions in a magnetic field. Those calutrons were built in great numbers at the plant at Y12 in Oak Ridge. Simultaneously, since nobody was sure that would work, they developed the gaseous diffusion plant technology for construction of the first gaseous diffusion plant, again, at Oak Ridge, at K25. So those were the sources for enriched uranium. Those two technologies had to be built and operating in a period of literally a couple of years. We must have flashed by some of them earlier, but if you want to see more, I've got the pictures here. We can look at them later. Huge plants. Nobody knew if they could be made to work in quantity, and yet the program was going nowhere without results. Simultaneously, they were building, first of all, a reactor at Oak Ridge called X1, X10. And then multiple reactors at Hanford, all this to make plutonium. And oh, by the way, you got to have a chemical plant to separate the plutonium from the uranium, which also had to be built at Hanford. So as we go on here, you'll see how these things proliferate. But what really broke the argument and pushed everybody ahead was August 49, when Russia tested their first nuclear device. Up to that point, people really didn't know what they were doing in Russia. They assumed they almost certainly were working on a nuclear weapon, but they didn't know much about it. And everybody thought it would be somewhere between 5 and maybe forever before the Russians would have a nuclear weapon. Truman himself is quoted as having said, never. Someone asked him, because after Roosevelt died, of course, Truman was president. Someone asked him, when do you think the Russians, no, he asked a scientist, I'm not sure if it was Oppenheimer or someone else, when they thought the Russians might have a bomb, and I think the answer they got was about 5 years. His response was, I'll tell you the answer is never. The Russians aren't smart enough ever to do this. This is Truman himself. Well, turned out it took them till August of 49. As we all know now, they got a lot of help from Klaus Fuchs and a couple of other people who were spies at Los Alamos, sending essentially a lot of technical information back to Russia to help them, because the Joe 1 device was indeed very similar to the test device that was used at Trinity. But that really changed the world in terms of what the U.S. felt it should do with its nuclear weapon program. It was obvious you couldn't just stand around and talk about it, and you couldn't take your time. You needed to move ahead more rapidly, build up a stockpile of at least 100 weapons, maybe several hundred weapons. All the while in the background, you've got Edward Teller and his group, particularly another scientist named Stanislav Ulam, coming up with ideas to make the secondary on a nuclear weapon work as a thermonuclear weapon, so that you could get the energy from fusion, not just from fission. They knew if it could be done, the yield would be upwards of 1,000 times greater than the yield from a fission weapon. So it was a huge number. It drove Teller certainly all through the late 40s and into the 50s to push harder and harder for development of thermonuclear weapons. At the same time, he and E.O. Lawrence, among others, were pushing to form a new laboratory in California. The argument being you need a competitor to Los Alamos, so that because people always do better when they have competitors. And so Teller and Lawrence were pushing for a laboratory in Los Alamos. They got it in September of 52. I said Los Alamos, I meant Livermore. They got it in 52 at Livermore. And in October of 52, the Mike test, which was fielded, of course, by Los Alamos, because Livermore was not even really running at that point. It was fielded by Los Alamos. It proved that thermonuclear weapons could be designed, built, and maybe made small enough to be carried in airplanes, although Mike was in fact so large it could not possibly have been in an airplane. But shortly thereafter, they did find ways to miniaturize it, and so the program moved forward. But these are the important events, particularly Joe 1 and the H-bomb test, that really then pushed the program into a whole new regime of material requirements and weapon construction requirements, so that the stockpiles grew from a few tens to a few hundreds to a few thousand in a period of about 5 years. I'm going to back up now and go through this in a little more detail. Just to give you a feel for what it was like at Los Alamos in the early 40s, here's a conference room at Los Alamos. You notice they outfitted them with the very best chairs that could be bought, I suppose, at Sears or Ward's, I'm not sure, but they're nice lawn chairs. The guy in front there is Bradbury, next to him is Manley. Just to Bradbury's left is Oppenheimer. Back to Oppenheimer's left is Richard Feynman. So if you can imagine sitting in a conference room with this set of people and perhaps giving a talk about what you thought was important in physics, it would be a challenge. It was quite a time. The lower picture is Los Alamos today. And I'll do this now as we go along and show you pictures of what some of these facilities began to look like. By May of '49, one of the divisions at Los Alamos had been stripped out, the one that did sort of the external engineering and the arming and fusing and firing. That division had been stripped out of Los Alamos, moved down to Albuquerque, renamed Sandia Corporation, and Bell Laboratories had been asked to take over management of that lab. But as I noted earlier, by September of '52, the University of California Radiation Laboratory was established in Livermore. Today it's LLNL. The picture at the bottom is Lawrence Livermore today. The picture at the top is Sandia today. So these have become rather large institutions, all having been built since 1950. Now for the production facilities. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in June of '43, construction started on the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant. The picture in the center is that plant after it was completed. What you're going to get from all this is sort of an unbelievable number of large, complex facilities that were built by the side of the program that was responsible for facilities, all being led by Groves, who by this time is a brigadier general. Started out a major. He had just, to give you a little more background, Groves had just completed building of the Pentagon. You all know what you have here in town, the Pentagon. Groves, in fact, led the construction of the Pentagon. He thought he was then going to get, he was a colonel at that point, he thought he was going to get an assignment to Europe, get to be a real fighting soldier. Instead, he got called in and told, no, we want you to lead this project called Manhattan. There's going to be a lot of construction to do. So he took the assignment, of course, and stayed with that assignment until he retired. And these are some of the plants that he built. Over to the left here, or to my left at least, is the Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge in the early days. And over on the right is the Y-12 plant today. So the spaces are all still there. And of course, the K-25 plant today is gone. But this one plus two more are built, as we'll see here in just a bit. This is June of '43. Construction started. More construction. The first sizable reactor for the program was first constructed at X10 at Oak Ridge, and then the remaining reactor for this point in time, we'll see in a minute here, are going to be built out at Hanford. They also built the Calutron plant at what's now Y12. They built a thermal diffusion plant because they thought that you could do some enrichment with thermal diffusion. You would do the remainder of the enrichment either with the calutrons or with the gaseous diffusion plants. And by February of 44, the big sum of 200 grams of U-235 was sent to Los Alamos so that they would have something to work with that was, in fact, a sizable quantity, if you can call 200 grams sizable. That's all they could do at the time. So that Los Alamos could use it in its research activities. By 53, Y12 also begins producing lithium-6, but that's jumping ahead across the time when you actually demonstrate that you can build a thermonuclear weapon. August of 43, we see reactors being built out at Hanford. First, it was a production pile. What that means is it's literally that. It's just a stack of uranium with tubes running through it so that you could generate plutonium and get it out of the reactor so that you could take it over to this plant in the bottom picture, which is the big, what these days we call canyons at Oak Ridge. It's the chemical processing plant to strip the plutonium out of the uranium body in which it was bred. We talk about the reactors that have to be built. You'll be astonished at the rate at which you can build reactors if you've got the green light to go do it because you're in a war. At Hanford, the first reactor that was called a reactor, at least, was up and running by February of 45. Then by 49, another reactor, H reactor, by 50, DR, 52, another, 55, another, 2. So you're building reactors almost at the rate of 1 a year. Certainly it's faster than 2 a year. And these are sizable reactors, as you can see from these photos. The next big event, of course, or big events in that time frame is you began to develop a testing program. Started out in 46, which is actually earlier than this April of 48, but in 46, the Army conducted a series of tests. The Army and the Navy, call it the DOD, conducted a series of tests at Bikini in the South Pacific, looking for the effects on military equipment, in particular ships. And then by 48, you're actually doing full-scale atmospheric testing at Eniwetok, which later in time, of course, becomes bigger and bigger in terms of the yield. Truman then in 50 selected Nevada to be the proving grounds for full-scale underground testing in the US. It wasn't just underground. Early on, of course, they were doing above-ground tests as well as underground tests at Nevada. But those programs then got underway by the 50s. After Joe, and as time went on, of course, after the Mike tests, then you end up with thermonuclear tests being conducted in the Pacific later on in Nevada as well, underground. Now we have to build out the rest of the complex. By the time you've had the Russians demonstrate their ability to make fission weapons, and our own scientists demonstrate thermonuclear weapons, it's clear you're going to have, at least it's clear to the people at that time, and you were going to have a larger stockpile than people originally anticipated. It wasn't going to be a few tens of weapons. It wasn't going to be a few hundred weapons. There was enough concern about what the Russians were doing that it was going to be thousands of weapons. So you're going to have a whole production complex. The earliest vestiges are at Burlington, Iowa, where you started doing weapon assembly in 47. Also, they established the neutron initiator manufacturing at Mound, Ohio. And we'll go on. Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey to do detonators. The Kansas City plant by February of 49 for non-nuclear component assembly. What you have here is a picture of the present day plant at Kansas City before it was actually built. The Pantex plant in Amarillo. What you see are present pictures of what they look like today, not what they looked like in 51. But by March of 51, you had established another weapon assembly plant in Amarillo, or just outside Amarillo, Texas. In Fernald, you did the construction for a uranium feedstock processing because you needed lots of uranium to run lots of reactors. Rocky Flats was into operation by 1952 to do pit manufacturing. Pinellas was established as a plant in 56 to manufacture neutron generators. And then at Savannah River, you begin building reactors, primarily in this case to make tritium so that you can make the secondary for a nuclear weapon, which has to have tritium and deuterium in some form in order to operate. So they started building reactors at Savannah River primarily to generate tritium as well as make plutonium. So they start building reactors in South Carolina in 52, and several more follow. L reactor, K reactor, C reactor, and then by 55 they install the facilities there to separate and purify the tritium so that it's available for use to boost the performance of primaries. Other major facilities in Idaho, what was then named the Idaho National Laboratory, another chemical processing plant, and finally 2 more gaseous diffusion plants, one at Paducah, Kentucky, and one at Portsmouth, Ohio. Okay, let's look at the important nuclear weapon explosive events. July 45 and August of 45, we all know about Trinity and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By August of 49, you've had the Russian Joe-1 test. The Mike test in October of 52 changed the world. And then as time went on, there was a 15 megaton test called Bravo, which was a so-called weaponized thermonuclear design. By November of 55, notice we had Mike in October of 52. By November of 55, the Russians have demonstrated their first real thermonuclear weapon capability as well at 1.6 megatons. You notice the scale of 1,000 pretty much holds. The early uranium fission bombs were 10 to 20 kilotons. The early thermonuclear bombs were 5 to 15 megatons. And then just to show the world they could do it, the Russians tested one called Tsar Bomba in October of 61, which is estimated by various parties somewhere between 50 and 58 megatons, the largest thermonuclear yield ever demonstrated on the face of the Earth. Here's what the test program looked like. If you think things are busy these days, how do you feel about the US program running anywhere from 20 to as many as 80 nuclear tests per year? Back in the early 50s and early 60s, that's what it looked like. The red lines are the Russian tests, and then you've got a few tests by other countries as well along the way. But those were very, very busy times for testing nuclear weapons and that were being developed to go into the stockpile. It was just meeting DoD needs. If you think about this carefully, you will almost certainly ask yourself whether we really needed that many different designs and whether we really needed that many nuclear weapons. But at the time, it was not debated in those terms at all, as far as I can determine. I wasn't there, but I was growing up at that time. And so here's the end of the story, the stockpile. By the early 60s now, remember, the early 60s, we already had put 30,000 weapons into the stockpile. The maximum, the blue chart is the U.S. The maximum number that ever went into the U.S. stockpile was just over 30,000. And since that time, it's been declining, and of course, today it's under 5,000. The Russians were not that far behind, and that's why there was such a fear of war. They built theirs up apparently to a number like 40,000, and they too have been reducing their stockpiles since the late 80s. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to take it all apart.